Signal for liftoff in T-minus 30.
Stand by for further instructions, Minnesota Black Robe Regiment.
Secondary guidance systems engaged.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, it will be on my mark.
All systems are a go. All systems are a go.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, you are over the target. You are authorized to fire at will.
Alrighty, thanks for stopping by Minnesota Black Robe Regiment. You all know me, you know what I do. This is another episode of TC and Friends Monday Night Musings. My poor guest tonight, Cody, didn't know he was going to be lumped into my friend category, but I don't know what else to call people I've met through Facebook who share a lot of the same views as me. I call them friends because those types of people are getting fewer and far between these days. And I wanted to introduce you to someone who has some intellect and is a Christian and really thinks around issues from a very deep perspective. And that's been the thing I've been impressed with the most with Cody as we have interacted. And we don't have a ton of conversations, but I watch a lot of what he says and does on Facebook, and I've delved in a little bit to his podcast that he hosts with his co-host Jacob, and I cannot tell you enough how refreshing it is to have someone who is markedly younger than me, kind of go countercultural in our time, where a lot of people who are much younger than I am tend to have a very hardcore leftist perspective. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring him on. So before we get going, make sure, if you're running low on your coffee supply, I have a few of my regulars I haven't heard from for a while. So you keep telling me how good it is. So you got to be drinking it. If you're drinking it, you got to be getting low. If you're getting low, you need to order so I can get it shipped out to you. And I got to get a hold of Brandon so I can get my next round ready. I've got the merchandise, and as always, I now have the subscribe star up. We have more and more exclusive content coming out. You guys are going to be very excited. Not on top of this conversation, I have a conversation coming up on Wednesday with a gentleman who's running for Minnesota State Auditor. He is a constitutionalist attorney, and we'll be doing some exclusive content after the live stream on Wednesday. We'll see. Maybe we can talk Cody into doing something really exclusive and giving us a breakdown of Kantian Christianity. That's been one of their topics recently on their show. So I want you guys to pay attention. This is probably going to be a heady conversation in a good way. The church has always been, in the United States, has always been on the forefront of fighting against tyranny, been on the forefront of standing up to dictatorial edicts and autocratic decision making. And honestly, the church for a very long time was on the forefront of individualism. And one of the topics that Cody talks about and is not afraid to touch on is the idea that the church today will not talk about individualism. By and large, the church is mostly interested in conformity, and conformity to a hive mind, if you will. And those things are incredibly important because it explains why the church, by and large, responded to the last 2 years of heavy-handedness by both federal, state, and local governments, and had no answers for how to respond, and actually, in some cases, rejected their own, in many congregations, rejected their own, if you will, parishioners or congregants when they spoke out. There is a story that broke over the last couple of years of a young lady who was disciplined out of her church, a Presbyterian church of America, PCA, not PCUSA, out of a so-called conservative Presbyterian church, was disciplined out for refusing to wear a mask. Not during worship, but in her own personal life. And someone complained about it to their church leadership. And they disciplined her out for the sin of murder. Because in their eyes, she was guilty of murdering. So these things are incredibly important. And so I've got my good friend Bull, who doesn't have anything better to do with his time than to tell me, get to the guest already. You know what, Travis? You shut your mouth up there, mister. I always do long intros. That's just who I am. Get used to it. But anyway, I'm going to just follow the direction of the hairy guy from up north. Cody, thanks for doing this tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me today.
Whenever I'm taking a drink, feel free to go ahead and just talk, because that's how I keep myself from talking over my guests.
Perfect.
Cody, how old are you, young man? Because you're
37.
markedly young. 37? Yeah, you're markedly younger than me and Bull. I'll tell you that.
Okay.
we had this. I think I might have had this conversation with Travis when I had him on. He's running for Congress in our 7th district. Anybody who's under the age of 40 is always going to be a young man in my eyes. And I have grandkids now, so I am an old man. So you have a podcast, and you also have a website, and you have a couple of Facebook pages, if I remember correctly. And they all kind of center around logic and reasoning. But maybe one of the most interesting is your page dedicated to Christianity and the philosopher Ayn Rand.
So you're talking about For the New Christian Intellectual. That's the Facebook page, podcast, YouTube channel, website.
And what was your impetus for that? Because, and you know this, I on a website that I need to get going again, I have written extensively about Western Christian culture, refer to it in a loving and euphemistic way, because it's far different than what true Christian culture should be like. What was your impetus for starting this movement of Christian intellectualism?
Well, the name For the New Christian Intellectual came from a book that was written by Ayn Rand. She's an atheist, a philosopher, and a novelist that lived through the 20th century. And she had a book called For the New Intellectual. And so my friend Jacob Brunton suggested, let's make a website and a podcast called For the New Christian Intellectual, in which we will engage with her unique contributions on the topic of rationality, especially for Christians, and then also what she says about motivation. And she has an unusual ethical code and ethical system that she calls rational egoism. Jacob Brunton and I looked at her philosophy and said there's some things in here that we cannot accept, but there are things that we can as Christians. And there are points that she makes, arguments that she makes that Christians haven't been talking about as much as they should. Part of it is upholding logic and reason rather than blind conformity. We reject the idea of blind faith. And, most Christians wouldn't say that they love blind faith, but we want to very clearly define what we think the opposite of that is. And then on the rational egoism thing, we would say, well, let's make a new idea called Christian egoism. And it's not all that new. It's somewhat within John Piper. It's also somewhat within Jonathan Edwards. And looking back, there have been other Christians.
Well, Piper rested very heavily on, in his mind, rested very heavily on Jonathan Edwards for his book, Desiring God.
Yes, he's pulling right from Jonathan Edwards.
I think there were places where Piper erred with his Christian hedonism. What do you see as a difference between Christian hedonism, as Piper described it, and how did you refer to Christian egoism?
Egoism. Well, the difference is just in the degree to which we want to emphasize this as key to human psychology, what a healthy human psychology looks like, and what a healthy outlook as far as your ethical code looks like. So Piper would embrace the idea that we ought to pursue our holy self-interest. And he has a poem called Gain. And he talks about how we ought to see God as being personally valuable to us. And so we will just say, yes, we believe that, we agree. And also we want to play out some of the implications of that. We believe that, for example, we believe that God is an egoist. So there's several videos we have on divine egoism, on God's motivation. God is in the heavens. He does as he pleases. Everything he does is for his name's sake, those kinds of things. So we want to bring out that, but then we also want to say, and as his followers, there is an aspect of what he is like that we need to imitate. So we, like if you think about Hebrews 12:2, it says that Jesus Christ, that he went to the cross and he endured that. He despised it, but he did it for the sake of the joy that was set before him. And we think that we ought to imitate him in his character in that aspect, which is when we suffer, we do not pick up our cross and carry it for the sake of self-sacrifice for its own sake. Rather, we are willing to pick up our cross, suffer, die to our sin, die to our old self, die even to some good things in this life if necessary, that by all means we may save some. So we have a reason for it. So this is a rational approach. We think that there ought to be a reason for whatever you're going to do, and that it needs to be framed in terms of personal interest. Why do I care that other people would be saved? If I don't really care myself, then I'm like the guy that is being described in 1 Corinthians 13. The guy that he does all the right things, he says all the right things, but he has not love. There's a way to live where you don't really have love. And the point that we're trying to make is that if you really love people, that's going to be something that is not just played out in your actions, but it's actually in your motivation as well. And we're trying to draw Christians to understand how you must have a personal motivation that is a personal interest. And so that's something that aligns with a lot of Rand's work. And so that's why we brought in some of her arguments.
Well, Rand rejected altruism.
Yes, defined as pathological altruism.
Right. She patently rejected the idea that anybody ever did anything for completely selfless motives. She always asserted that everything came down to you stand to gain something out of this. And I think the last 2 years for the church, especially, and this is how for my watching audience, especially for those in my audience who are not necessarily Christian or think towards philosophy, these are why these things are important. The church has demonstrated pathological altruism, especially over the last 2 years, with churches being more than willing to comply with pretty much every edict that was cast at them. Some of the churches that didn't were some of the ones that you and I would never go to, which is ironic. Rodney Howard Brown, the Holy Ghost bartender guy down there in Florida, but he actually took the right position on resisting the authority of the state. But for the most part, churches that you refer to in language that my audience may understand as neo-Calvinist or neo-Reformed, because I have a lot of people who will, in my audience, who will refer to neocons and so-called conservatives. There are a lot of neo-Reformed, neo-Calvinistic churches who complied with everything that the state told them to do for that pathological altruism of, it's all about sacrifice. Everything about my faith has to be all about sacrifice all the time. And you and Jacob on your show, and we'll work on getting Jacob on here too, you kind of patently reject that pathological altruism and do not see it as an integral part of Christianity, correct?
Yes, and there's one thing I wanted to mention about Rand's perspective. She didn't think that everybody acts egoistically. She thinks that that's something that you have to make a choice. That most of the time, just by the nature of the fact that we are living, it's easy for us to do the things that come naturally for our own interest, like eating and taking care of ourselves. But unless you choose to act in terms of your personal interest on purpose and principle, she thinks that many people will, from time to time, just act ambivalently in regard to this question of their own self-interest. perhaps they'll let some other principle take priority over their self-interest. An example would be vaccinations, because your collective says that you're a murderer if you don't do this. Well, we think that you have the responsibility to think for yourself, and you have the responsibility to take care of yourself. It's your life that you've been given to steward. And so it doesn't matter what other people say. We don't have an obligation to what other people say. And that translates into the political, the entire political spectrum, how we conceive of what our obligations are to other people, how we conceive of individual rights. You can see how if you believe in rationality and if you believe in self-interest, personal self-interest, then that's going to play out in, well, I think that I have the right to live my life as I want. You have the right to live your life as you want, and we don't interfere with each other. So you get the constitutional conservative conception of the state as well.
So how do you address, there again, looking at pathological altruism, how do you address people who will point to places like Philippians 2 and say, well, don't always just look out for the interest of yourself, but always look out for the interest of others? Because that was really thrown at me hard and heavy over the last couple of years. You're not thinking about others, especially other Christians, when you have this position that you have about not following lockdown orders, not following jab mandates, not following mask mandates. You're not taking into consideration other people. And my response was, look, you want to wear a mask, you wear a mask. I don't want to wear a mask, so I don't want to wear a mask. If I take this to its logical conclusion, you're somehow have the ability as a Christian brother or sister, if you think that I should be wearing a mask and I cave to that, then really what's ended up happening is you haven't been looking out for my interest. You're only looking out for your interest, but asserting that the best thing for me is to do what you want me to do in front of you. And that becomes a very dangerous and slippery slope within the church when that particular crowd gets to dictate how you interpret a passage like Philippians 2. Do you see that as being part and parcel of the problem with the direction the broader church has taken here in the United States?
I do. I think that in that discussion and controversy, there is something that the other side has rhetorically in their favor, which is that they can make a claim that we don't want to make people put in danger. We want to err on the side of safety. And so if there are questions that are not answered, like for example, it hasn't even been established that this or that measure is going to keep people safe. But if we're not sure, they might be able to appeal to safety. And we can't necessarily do that. I'm not going to make an argument that I know that if I resist the vaccination or the mask or whatever, that it's going to be better for me or better for you. I don't know any of that. What I'm going to argue is take a step back from the question of the fact of the matter, what is safer, and ask yourself the question, who gets to decide how each person lives their life? This is a question of the principle of ownership of your life and individual rights. You have to, either side, if they're going to establish their case here, is going to have to answer that question. Why is it that this decision gets to be put in the hands of the state, or that this gets to be put in the hands of your church or anything like that? And if you don't have a philosophy of politics, if you don't have a theology of politics, then how are you going to answer that question? And I think that most people are not on the level of looking philosophically or theologically. They would rather just listen to what their thought leaders say on the issue and just trust them. Listen to what Jonathan Leeman says or something like that.
Well, I think you used a phrase that I think a lot of people aren't comfortable with, and you said thought leaders. And I think that's really important when we think about where the United States has been for the last couple of years, especially, but especially for the broader church in the U.S. We don't really have elders and pastors for the most part anymore in even Reformed congregations. We really do have thought leaders. And we look to them to dictate to us exactly how we should think on an issue. And whatever they say is what we parrot. But the problem is that a lot of times they're only parroting what they're hearing from the people in their own congregation, or from, even worse, from cultural sources, whether it be media or bigger names within, Christianity that seem to have a platform, much like, Moore or Albert Mohler and others. And instead of being shepherds, under shepherds, they have become those thought leaders. They're, casting vision. We heard that a lot. And I think that has had an incredibly detrimental effect, because there's really not a lot of thinking happening at the level of either the leadership of a local congregation or in the laity, because we have dismissed or walked away from Christianity being not just a relationship, because I hear you and I both hear that all the time. Christianity is not a religion. It's just a relationship. That's all it is. It's just a relationship. So we've walked away from Christianity being what it is, which is a religion, but also a deeply philosophical religion, to that of being merely what I get out of this deal and how it makes me feel, which has led us to where we are, where we have thought leaders now instead of pastors and elders who are teaching and instructing and leading people to good conclusions with what they're studying. Where do you think that started?
It is the default position to follow the crowd and to not think for yourself. It takes energy to think for yourself. So there's always going to be a tendency, whether you're just talking about the way you live your own life, the way you set your own goals, there will be a tendency to just fall into drift unless you take the time and put in the work to think. It's the same thing with movements. It's the same thing with the evangelical movement. So it's no surprise that there would be this tendency of collectivism. You can see it throughout the history of the church. Martin Luther actually stood up to the collective of his day and said that he saw what the Bible said, and then he saw what the different councils had said in the past and how they contradicted each other, and some of them contradicted the Bible. And he said, I'm just going to have to go with based on what my own eyes see. And that was honesty. And sometimes you get to that moment where you look at your collective and you say, you are all not thinking. And what Luther said is, your brains have turned into mushrooms. I think it's because it hasn't been shining the bright light of inquiry into the process. It's rather just sort of looking sideways and asking, what's the guy next to me doing? It's natural human behavior, and it must be identified as a temptation. And just like there are other temptations to laziness or to fits of anger or any other kind of temptations that a person might have, you have a temptation to mental stagnation. And that's one explanation. Now, there are others as well. There are causal explanations for why cult-like behavior is self-replicating. And within the evangelical movement, you see cult-like behavior where the pastor at different mega churches, they all sort of follow the thought leader because that saves them the effort. They're right. going to read the latest book from the thought leader nationwide that tells them what the right political theology is. And then they're going to say that to their congregants, and the congregants are going to be happy because now we've been saved as congregants from having to do the hard work. We know what is right because our thought leader has told us. And it's a matter of, did you verify? Fundamentally, I think that's the answer. But there are some things within Christianity that are temptations as well. Or there are ideas within Christianity that if you don't think carefully about them, they could become an excuse or a rationalization for becoming a conformist. Like, for example, judge not, that you be not judged. And the idea of not being a divisive person. Those kinds of ideas, if you don't think carefully about them, if you realize there's the teaching that God is love, and you've heard, love your neighbor, hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those that despitefully persecute you. Okay, you take all those ideas, but you don't think carefully about when and where they ought to be applied and in what way.
Right.
Did Jesus actually turn the other cheek when slapped across the cheek? No, he called out the injustice. Did Paul turn the other cheek when he was struck? No, he turned to them and he said, you whitewashed tomb. The natural response when your rights have been violated ought to be to protest and to say, my rights have been violated, because there is something at stake here. There's a value, and it's the value of due process and the rule of law. That's something that you would speak up for. It's not the same thing as what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 5, go the extra mile or turn the other cheek in some other setting. So you had to ask yourself, what is the context? And I think that it just, because of those sort of easy little sound bites, like don't judge and just love, those
Right.
kinds of things, they all add up to, in the mind of many people, an excuse to go on not thinking, and it's just a default.
We, in the history of the U.S., two works, philosophically speaking, really had an influence on the church in the colonies, in the British colonies, and what in by my estimation, Lex Rex by Rutherford, which was really kind of the launching point for John Locke and his work. You can hear in Locke his reliance upon Samuel Rutherford's work in Lex Rex. He just kind of, I don't want to say made it neutral, relied heavily on Locke, relied heavily on the scriptures, or not on Rutherford, but at the same time, as he's relying on that, he's taking it outside of the realm of Christianity and he's applying it to in a broader sense, an all-religious perspective. And so when you look at Rutherfordian philosophy and Lockean philosophy and the inception of the war for independence here in the United States and the writing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, I think those two works were pivotally important to the foundation of our republic. And the church was really on board with that, by and large. I mean, there were clearly, Christians and congregations that weren't on board with the war for independence, but by and large, Christians were like, okay, yeah, now's the time. We need to have an end to this tyranny from Great Britain. We have the justification in the scriptures. What happened between the early or the mid 1770s to now that has been foundational in changing the way Christians think about resistance to tyrannical authority?
There's a book that I recommend on this by C. Bradley Thompson, and I think the book is called America's Revolutionary Mind, if I'm not mistaken. I've listened to it on audio a couple times, and he describes what caused the mindset of the American revolutionaries and then what happened after as well. Sort of the last several chapters, he talks about what happened after. So there was an influx of ideas from the German education system, universities, right after the time of the American Revolution. Immanuel Kant was flourishing around the time of the American Revolution and a little after it. And Americans would send their children over to Germany because that was where the best universities were. They'd come back and then they would bring with them a Kantian outlook, and the ideas within Kant ended up developing into a totalitarian statism type mindset. And you see that in Hegel, who was influenced by Kant. You also see it in anyone that was influenced by Hegel, Karl Marx, Adolf Hitler, and people like that. So, but within the United States, it didn't take such a drastic form so quickly. You don't have people in the 1860s in the United States writing communist manifestos. But what you did have is there was an intellectual movement that was sowing the seeds for that kind of thing, so that by the time that you get to Woodrow Wilson, he was explicitly along those same lines as Hegel, explicitly wanting to reject the Declaration of Independence, wanting to reinterpret the Constitution for our new generation, and that was going to involve giving the state more power. So to get into like the whole reasons for why that is, it would be a pretty big conversation. But I would say that part of the reason why there was a motivation in the United States to embrace some of the collectivism and the statism that was being taught in Germany was that the intellectuals before the Civil War living in the South wanted to make an argument for why socialism, or something kind of like socialism, was the ideal system. And they had a traditionalist socialist understanding, and that was the plantation economy. They thought that they could argue that it was the best for everyone involved. And that they thought that the Southern economy at that time was the height of human flourishing. And they wanted to try to ground it in traditionalism and Aristotle, but also they were eager to ground it in some of the ideas of Hegel, this idea that history has its sort of moves and that you have to stay within the pattern of history. And therefore that if this is what you find yourself in your generation and the previous generation have been using this form of chattel slavery, well, then that itself is proof that history wants this to happen. And that's Hegel. Now they absorbed it, and after the South lost the war, they actually won the intellectual war. Southern intellectuals went on after the war to continue advocating this same Hegelian outlook. So that's all within Thompson's book.
So you actually see a Hegelian influence in the South, where I see a pretty heavy Hegelian influence in the North, because I do not think that Abraham Lincoln is the hero of the Republic that everybody tries to make him out to be. And
there is something there. I agree.
Okay, good. Whew, I thought our friendship was about to end. But I think because what we saw with Lincoln was a centralization of power at all cost. And he patently rejected the idea that freeing the slaves was really ultimately what he wanted. His entire goal was preservation of the Republic, but what his preservation of the Republic meant was a centralized power at the federal level, which to me is very Hegelian.
Yeah, I would say that there is something to that. Ultimately, you have a battle between two people on the same kind of premises. So what do you think is going to happen?
Well, one's going to lose. So
everyone's going to lose in this case.
Yeah, well, we did. We all lost, because the victory of the North's victory over the South in this situation really paved the way for the federal state to become the ultimate authority in everyone's life. And I'm not saying that we would have been better off if we would have had a Confederate States and a Northern States, or whatever that would have ended up becoming. But it did pave a way for a very centralized, very statist mentality. I just never thought. I guess you'd have to give me a little background on how the Hegelians influenced the South. Are you thinking of anybody in particular in the South? Because you don't see that in Lee, who's considered kind of the premier liberty-loving individual of the South. I mean, the guy hated slavery, didn't own slaves himself, saw that slavery could be abolished and should be abolished, but it couldn't happen at the drop of a hat, couldn't happen right now, because it would be completely destructive to the Republic, which was why he kind of chose the side that he did. So who are you thinking of in the South that had that Hegelian influence that actually ended up winning, even though they lost the war, lost the battle, they ended up winning the war in your perspective? Is there someone in particular you're thinking of, or are they just not that well known?
They're names that are not all that well known today, and I have to refresh myself on the names, because I'm just referring to Thompson's book, and I'm not a historian, so and especially a historian of the Civil War in the South. So there may be things that I'm missing. There may be perspectives on that where somebody could correct me. I would say I think Dabney might be one to look at, and all the way into the 20th century, you could go to Richard Weaver and the conservative movement that is developed in the 20th century. That is a traditionalist conservative or paleoconservative is
Be careful, you hurt. That hurt.
It has its roots in some of the Southern thinkers. Now, there are going to be things in there that I agree with, that with any tradition. I mean, if I were to look at which political party I most endorse in the history of the United States, I would say it would be the Bourbon Democrats back in the late 1800s. Like they were right about their conceptions of the limits of the federal government. So yeah, that's something that I'm definitely out of my depths to be able to tell you the names, but we could look them up and we could see what their statements were and see whether it tracks.
That's a whole different show, especially when we're trying to keep it to not very long tonight. When did we see it take a turn? Like to use the euphemism, when did it go south?
Well, after the Civil War, there was a reinterpretation of the meaning of the Constitution. Before, the amendments had been taken as a limit on what the Congress was able to do, the federal government and the executive was able to do. And after it was taken as a principle for what everybody's individual right was. And so there's a problem there, right? Now, it may take a little bit to explain this problem, but are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it was up to the Civil War. The Constitution had always worked as a fence to keep the federal government in check, to keep it in place. And the argument after the Civil War became, is this a definition of my negative rights? And so people understand negative right. You have to understand negative rights versus positive rights, and that's a completely different conversation. But the Constitution then became an argument about what your negative rights were, and it became a very, very much definitionally about individual rights as opposed to a check on the federal government. And I think that was by design. That's my perspective. I don't know if that's how you see it as well.
Yeah, the way I see the vision of the founding fathers was these are the things that the federal government is not able to take away from the states and the people. It was a list of the things the federal government couldn't take away. That doesn't mean that the states couldn't take them away from their own people. According to the original understanding of the Constitution, if your city wanted to deny you the ability to have freedom of the press or something like that, there was nothing that the federal government could do. They couldn't send troops in to tell the city stop. That wasn't their authority. That authority was explicitly denied from the federal government their authority was explicitly denied that they could deny individual people the freedom of the press, but it doesn't say anything about whether the cities could or whether the states could. Right. And then but after the Civil War, the interpretation was these things in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, these things are, and anything else that comes along after that, they are rules about what the federal government must preserve no matter where you are within the territory of the United States. And that's a major difference, because then what's going to happen is you have this concept of the federal government becoming more powerful in order to come in and preserve those rights. And you've separated this idea of the distinction between different levels of government having different areas of authority. At this point, it becomes just as a fact that the federal government can make whatever policies it wants and impose them on whoever it wants in whatever way it wants. And that's going to grow over time. Now, with the increase of the people being educated in Germany, believing in Marxism or believing in socialism or collectivism of some form, what's going to happen in the government is they're going to impose an income tax, which you see in the early 20th century. And then you see they're going to have overall, like the progressive movement. They came in the end of the 1800s, and that continues to grow to this day. The progressive movement wants the state to solve everyone's problems, to social engineering type programs. And that's essentially the change in the American mindset. If you're looking for the cause of how we got to where we are today with our problems with government overreach.
So we see this played out if they want to approach this very logically, and I want to be sure that I believe that the way most of the states have operated as they form their own constitutions was an embrace of, even prior to the Civil War, the states embraced all of the principles, for the most part, in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, saying, like, we're also not going to tread on your First Amendment. We're also not going to tread on your Second Amendment. But what we do see by way of philosophy is, like here in the state of Minnesota, if the state passes a statute nation or statewide about how long your grass can be, and they max out at 4.5 inches. Your grass can be no taller than 4.5 inches. The county can come in and pass their own ordinance or their own code and say, well, here in XYZ County, even though the state says your grass can't be any taller than 4.5 inches, we're going to say your grass can't be any taller than 3.5 inches. And what the state's policy is you can pass whatever ordinance you want as long as it's not less restrictive than our ordinance. And so the county passes it, and goes from 4.5 to 3.5. And then the city steps in and says, well, we're going to pass an ordinance that says you can't have your grass in your yard any taller than 2.5 inches. Because what they're doing is completely in line with the idea that the most control, governmentally, if you want to use that term, is at the municipal level, the local level. And no one has an issue with that. But I do, frankly. I want them out of my life altogether. I'm kind of getting to the point where I don't want to listen to any of them anymore. But because I don't trust them. But ultimately, that's really the way the decentralization of power was to work under the guidance and the leadership of what the founding fathers and the authors of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights actually intended. What I saw was kind of what you were saying was the Civil War happened and that all got flipped on its head. So now the feds can tell everybody what they have to do all the time. And if you don't, we're gonna crack down on you, and we're gonna destroy your economy. And we saw that with you probably don't remember this, but when we went with the seatbelt laws here in the United States, there was a time where you didn't have to wear a seatbelt to drive, but the federal government stepped in and said, "You will pass this ordinance this law, and if you do not pass this law, we're going to take away your funding for your highways and your interstates." And they held the gun of money at the head of the states, and the states passed it. It's complete bastardization of what the founding fathers really intended, and that I think is a direct result of a flipping of the intent of the Constitution on its head after the end of the Civil War.
Yes, and then once they had a desire to grab more power for the federal government, then it tended. You could look in the Elastic Clause. You can look in the interstate commerce, whatever that's a clause or whatever it is, and they found ways to make it so that they could have antitrust regulation and the Securities and Exchange Commission and every different alphabet. And that's the way they did it while appearing to look constitutional. But it's not ultimately a question of legal theory. It's ultimately a question of how do you conceive of society?
Right.
Do you think that it's morally right for people to get to choose what they're going to do with their own money and who they're going to work for, what they're going to make? Do you believe it's morally right for them to have that ability? And if you don't believe that it's morally right, then eventually that legal right is going to erode by whatever pattern.
Right. See, that's the thing that I wish more people would understand, is that that was Rutherford's argument was about the moral correctness of man to resist the authoritarian dictatorship of a king, because it's been emphasized. I know you're familiar with Matt Truwalla. And I don't know your take on him as far as some of what he says in his work, The Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates. But a lot of what he rests on is the idea that for years, the king was authority over everything all the time. Rutherford came along and encapsulated generations, thousands of years of Christian teaching that said that no, God is the king, the law of God is the king, so law is king, and the king himself is even subject to that. And that is what gave rise to the American Republic, and we've forgotten that, and the church has been on board with that. And now I even had to correct myself in this, is that there was a time where I would advocate it, like, hey, Romans 13, bro. Romans 13. And the intellectual weakness of American Christianity is such that you just quote something like Romans 13, and everybody just kind of gets in line and says, oh yeah, you're right. I guess if they come tell you got to shut down your church, you got to shut down your church because, Romans 13. And as you were saying earlier, and I think as it ties into this portion of the conversation, is that there's no thought put into it. What's actually happening in Romans 13, or you look at the 1 Peter 2, and if I quote something wrong, if I say something wrong, correct me, because I get about 1,000 thoughts going in my head at a time. And all of these things play out, and they have these tendrils and these fingers that kind of stretch out across our society, especially in a supposedly Judeo-Christian philosophical worldview. And everybody has a different interpretation of it. And everybody wants to try and use that interpretation to justify their action or their inaction. And I think it has gotten exponentially worse since the end of the Civil War, but especially since I'll go back to the 50s and 60s. It's gotten exponentially worse from there, and we've only seen that accelerate over the last 15 years, especially. And what we're seeing now is not an acceleration of the Christian churches and Christians in general having a lack of intellect, but it's just an exposing of that lack of intellect and the lack of the ability to think for themselves and step away from generations of indoctrination by their churches. Do you think it's been intentional that churches have shied away from teaching their people to be intellects? Because what I see in the vast majority of people who claim to be Christian, and I'm sure you and Jacob see this too, there's a rejection of logic. There's a rejection of reasoning within the church today. It's almost seen as dangerous or too worldly or too fleshly.
It's difficult to know how we got where we are. I would say there's just a constellation of reasons. One would be that the kind of people that are capable of speaking well in front of a group of others and being charismatic and encouraging other people to follow their lead, that doesn't always select for being somebody that likes to read a lot of books. So you might have these small churches with thinking pastors, and you might have these large churches with feeling pastors. And if you look at it from the point of view of natural selection, what kind of churches will grow and be able to plant more churches? I think that a certain kind of church reproduces itself in our current environment more effectively than a different kind of church. But that doesn't mean that it's a better kind of church. Mold reproduces itself more effectively when it's dark and humid. And so the kind of people that we are as a society is that's the foundational issue. The kind of people that will hire a man to not teach them anything over what you think like a third grade kid could understand. And the sermons talk like they're talking to babies. Like the kind of people that will hire that man, well, they're going to get what they pay for. But why are they looking for that? Well, every individual person must decide whether they have a hunger for knowledge and truth and for seeking the truth. Like is seeking the truth on difficult topics part of my life or not? And when you get even 10% of people in a society that really believe in seeking truth, then you'll have a different kind of culture than you have like today.
Sarah, she's local here. She says this, and she's probably not going to appreciate my answer to this. She says, our churches have become a part of the world, yearning to fill seats instead of being set apart, instead of being salt of the earth. And Sarah, I would actually disagree with that on the face of what you're saying. I believe that the reason we're seeing compliance within the church is not because they're seeking to be part of the world, but because they've taken an anti-intellectual, anti-logic, anti-reasoning perspective and then view anything that appears to be political, socio-political, socio-cultural and engaging in logic and reasoning as to be too worldly. So therefore, I'm going to completely set myself apart from that worldliness. I'm not going to involve myself in the day-to-day politics. I'm not going to involve myself in the day-to-day philosophical debates because I'm a Christian and all I do is I read the Bible, or I trust somebody else to read the Bible to me, and that's all that matters to me. And it ends up manifest. You know what? This is driving me crazy. I think can anybody else see the cobweb in my screen? No, I must be losing my mind. What ends up happening is that they've completely dismissed themselves from actually engaging and changing the world through the philosophical perspective and the lens of Scripture, because we don't have any arguments when somebody that we disagree with, who might be an atheist or a left-leaning Christian, where, oh well, I don't want to have those conversations. I'm not here for that. I'm not here for any of that kind of stuff. I'm just here to love Jesus because the gospel's the answer to everything. And that goes a little bit to what you and Jacob said on a recent episode, which is the reference to, well, the Ten Commandments only exist to show man his inability to follow the Ten Commandments. And there is a truth to that, but there's also a negative to that as well. And I think that exposes the weakness of the church, especially in light of tyranny today, because the church doesn't have any moral ground anymore to stand up against tyranny when we've had it forced on us that there's God and then there's government, and you do everything that the government says because God has appointed the government over you.
I agree with your response to the question, pointing out the role of just, do we have active minds or not? And there's just different kinds of conformity. There's different groups that have a different way of being mindless to some degree or another in some context. And there may be people that are very socially conservative or even politically conservative and would align with me that don't want to talk about it very much for whatever reason because of an anti-intellectual bent. And then there would be others that they're thinking, oh, it's time to get intellectual. And then they open up a book by Tim Keller to understand how they should engage the culture's ideas. And so one of the trends that I see is because people are not generally all that philosophically astute, they do not realize the extent that they are accepting whatever the worldview of the current age is. So
Right.
there's a certain range of views from Fox News on one side to MSNBC on the other about what people think the United States government should be doing and how much the taxes should be and how much the government should be taking care of people and
Right.
how much of a welfare state we should have and who gets to be the recipient. There's a range of views. Someone like me, I would look at it and say, Fox is way too liberal for me. Liberal on the issue of whether or not we should be taxing people, extorting money from them, and then using it for whatever handouts or subsidies or anything like that, or entitlements. And so I think that somebody like me comes along and people just say, wait a minute, that's not normal. And it's kind of freaky. Like you're just a radical, you know, do you have a compound?
Boy, do I know
somewhere?
that feeling there, Cody.
Right. Yeah. So it's just, no, I've just thought about this. I've thought about it and I've come to a certain conclusion, and I'm happy to talk about it with people. It doesn't have to be the topic of every conversation, but sometimes there needs to be this. Let's sit down and figure out, why do we actually believe what we believe? And anyway, this tendency to just absorb by osmosis what other people consider to be normal or within a range of normal, that's part of it. They call it the Overton window. And I think that within churches, there's different kinds of people. We have to understand that there are different kinds of people, and you can be friends with different kinds of people. And there are some people that do not really want to think about these issues all that much. And that is okay. But when they go to vote, they do take a moral responsibility for voting, because at that point, they're entrusting somebody else with a gun to tell me what is right and wrong and what I can do and can't do. And so that's a huge responsibility. And so I think there needs to be a place within the moral teaching of the church to help people understand the weight of that.
You almost sound like you might be a libertarian.
Well, Ayn Rand's political perspective is very close to mine. Yeah, libertarian-ish, constitutional conservative. Yeah, are you pretty similar to that?
Yeah, oh, well, I'm definitely a constitutional conservative, probably a little bit more paleo-con than others, but finding myself aligning with my libertarian friends and brothers and sisters more often than not anymore. Because, as you were saying, like I look at Fox News and I'm like, who are these leftists? I don't like. I think Tucker Carlson and maybe Greg Gutfeld about all I can stomach over there anymore, and in mostly just Tucker. But I hear much of what you're saying in the same light of what I've been saying, which is, look, reasoning, logic, and intellect has to be brought to bear on these issues, and it's not just enough anymore to sit back and say, "Oh, I'm a Christian, so this is why I vote the way I vote." Because, as you were saying, there are broad spectrums of people who claim to be Christian who vote a lot of different ways, who have a lot of different views, and some of the most ardent so-called Christians are some of the most uh, ardent supporters of Marxism, and they'll point to the scriptures and go, "See, Jesus was a Marxist. The early church was socialism," because they have a complete misunderstanding about what was actually being said, and the emphasis of what's happening in the early days of the church. And there are, at the same time, people who call themselves conservatives. I look at them and refer to them as, I coined the phrase normicons. I stole neocon and normies, and I just decided to call them normicons. Well, it's actually, I introduced that phrase when we had Walter Hudson on, and Walter said he was going to steal that from me. So you'll have to ask him if he's quoted me in that lately. But other people who literally are supposed conservatives who have no idea why they believe what they believe. They just know they hate abortion unless it's, it's okay in certain situations. And I'm like I'm anti-gay marriage because I'm a Christian, but they don't have a reason for it. They don't have an intellectual response other than to parrot what they're hearing in their culture, in their subset, in their tribe, if you will. And I've all it frustrates me because they should be able to articulate, why do you believe what you believe? And you and Jacob talk about this a lot. Epistemology is a huge, huge deal in foundational thought and in even your morality. Because if your epistemology is off, your morality is going to be wrong.
Yes, for everybody listening, epistemology is a field of philosophy. There's metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, political theory, aesthetics. But epistemology, this is a study of how we know, what it means to know, what do we have to do, what procedure do we have to follow in order to obtain knowledge, and then once we have obtained it, what is its status? Is it certain? There's all these rules, and part of that is understanding what logic is. Part of it is just understanding that we have to have a commitment to objectivity, and we have to be careful when we make our concepts. There's all kinds of concepts that are floating around lately that just the very concept itself is an absurd idea, and we could talk about
Give
that.
us an example. Give us an example of something that you see as one of those absurd ideas.
Sure. So you've heard of isolationism. That's an idea, right? Somebody says like isolationism as a foreign policy, and I wouldn't treat that as if it could be a concept for a foreign policy, because it seems to make a claim that I disagree with. Just even using the term makes a claim, and the claim is that either you're an interventionist or you're an isolationist. Well,
it's the binary thinking of you're one or the other.
Yeah, you have to ask yourself, well, what's the situation? Like, there may be a situation where it's appropriate or not appropriate. What's the principle? And it almost throws it out as if it's like it's just you just choose what camp you're in. But there is a principle for when the federal government should be engaging in a war and when it shouldn't. And likewise for domestic issues, there is a principle for when it's the federal government's role and when it's not. And if someone like me, here's just another one, is extremist. And by the way, I'm borrowing these from Ayn Rand. These aren't original to me. Extremist is a term that gets thrown around, and it's like extremism, extremists. What is it? That's just an insult but I'm extremely committed to logic. Are you? Like, you have
Does
to,
that make
you
you
have
an
to think about it.
extremist?
Yeah. Another one from an author that I appreciate named Harry Binswanger. He says homelessness, and a lot of these leftist neologisms, homelessness. It's like homelessness. Just the very term, it suggests that one day somebody was walking down the street and all of a sudden he was struck by a bout of homelessness. Oh, it throws out the context. How did this happen? And there's other terms like that that leftists will often use. This appeal to women's health. What is that? When we say the Republicans hate women's health, what are we talking about here? Why are we using this weird language to obscure the fact of what you are trying to pay for? So all these are just examples of the importance of concepts. Words are our tool of understanding and categorizing the truth. And so if you mess with other people's concepts, then you are trying to scramble their mind. We have to understand that if you believe that truth is important, you believe in the sanctity of truth, then we should also believe in the sanctity of language and not committing acts of verbicide, which is what we see leftists doing, and even anybody can do it in different ways.
Commonly known as deconstructionism.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So anytime you see somebody doing something that's postmodern deconstruction, critical theory type stuff, what they are usually doing is trying to redefine terms so that if you believe in capitalism, that's racism and those kinds of things. And so a lot of what we need to do is epistemological, and just in the sense of we need to mind our definitions and our concepts. And that goes for within the political realm. It goes for in the church as well. Just thinking very clearly about the terms that we're using.
Well, let me I don't want to say push back, but let me touch on something. So like you brought up isolationism, and I philosophically I am an isolationist in that I could sit down and give you an express reason for why I believe what I believe. Foundationally, philosophically, I can do that. Now, it may not be a 2-minute conversation. There's really no such thing as a 2-minute conversation with me, but I can sit down and explain to you why I have arrived at the principles that I have arrived at, and more than likely, for a lot of people who would even consider themselves conservative, but are maybe a little bit more war hockey, they'd probably, oh yeah, that good point. I think that valid argumentation there, but I think you're right in that isolationism, if I understand you correctly, isolationism, when understood correctly, isn't the problem. It's the problem is we throw out these one-word descriptors of a position that we hold, and oftentimes have never put any thought or philosophy or reasoning or logic or whatever it might be behind it. We've just heard somebody we respect say it, and therefore that's the position I hold to, and I have no idea what I'm talking about. Is that kind of what you're pushing against?
Yes. So say, for instance, that there was we were considering a foreign war, and I said I don't think the United States has any business getting involved in that war. And then somebody uses an insult against me and says, "Oh, you're just an isolationist." My concern is with the usage of the term. If they were to just say I'm just an isolationist, then what they're doing is implying that there's some position that I just hold to unthinkingly. Whereas my own position might be that I'm not against isolation in principle. I'm or in favor of it in principle. I'm in favor of not getting involved in this particular war. So that's just an instance. And I don't mean to debate you on the topic.
I
of
wasn't
whether or
looking
not
for a debate. I was trying to make sure that people were understanding that you weren't throwing this out there as like, here's this thing that's really bad because you say it's really bad. What you're saying is that the practical reality is that most people use words, use phrases, use terminology. They have no thought at all behind why they say what they say or believe what they believe. They're just parroting. And that's incredibly dangerous in light of current socio-cultural, socio-political issues within the church today, because we're parroting thought leaders and we're really kind of doing whatever they tell us to do.
Yes. Yeah. A famous example would be Karl Marx considered that all property was theft. And this is an example of inverting the hierarchy of how concepts work. Just to give you an idea of a taste of what epistemology does for us, we can analyze Marx and his tricks We can say, well, wait a minute. You're talking about how you think that all property is theft. So then what do you think theft is? Ask him to define theft. Wouldn't it be stealing someone else's property? So then although already he's found himself in an incoherence. And that's as simple as just asking what the words mean. And that's what I mean. Just getting really good at asking what the words mean.
Do you think that a lot of people like to blame social media today for a lack of interaction between people? And I know we're coming up not on your hard and fast, but a little bit coming up on you being on for about an hour, and I want to respect your time and show you the appreciation by not keeping you here for as long as I'd like to keep you here. This is a conversation long past due. But a lot of people try to blame social media and in digital technology for people's inability to interact. And I wonder, me personally, if social media is the cause, or if social media is the logical conclusion of people walking away from the willingness and the ability to have intellectual, philosophical, and logical conversations. And I think there again, that's very prevalent in the church. Like, I don't know where, like when I can afford to drive the 30 miles anymore to go to church, as I choose between driving to go to work, driving to go to church. I attend as a Calvinistic Baptist. I attend a Presbyterian church. But what I see there is there are people who are willing to engage on an intellectual level, even when there's a variance and difference in ideas, but that's shrinking, especially it's more noticeable to me in the Presbyterian circles, because for years Presbyterians were kind of known as the nerds, the thinkers, the philosophers, and that comes from, you look at one of the greatest theological minds, in my perspective, of the last 100 years within Christianity, especially Presbyterianism, if you will, was Francis Schaeffer, who was an intellect, par excellence. Maybe you disagree. I don't know. I just find Schaeffer to be incredibly compelling. And he was like, where I go to church, Schaeffer was part and parcel of kind of the congregation, because I attend church in Rochester, Minnesota, which is where Schaeffer was when he was battling his fatal illness. And there's a L'Abri society there. And these people take great satisfaction in having had been part of this L'Abri society. And I'm going, but I'm running into people here who don't think at the same level and don't want to. They don't want to challenge. And I think that's growing across all of Christianity. Do you see it the same way? I mean, because you had experiences when you were at Southern Seminary that led you to have some of the same thoughts, is kind of how I was understanding some of what you were saying.
Yes, at Southern Seminary there was. I remember one friend, just in passing, I had mentioned that I really liked this one person because their theological work was philosophical, and I appreciated that. And he says, yes, yeah, I like that he has philosophy, but he keeps it in its place. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, like,
What
what's
does
the
that
relation?
what does that even mean?
So like we can have these conversations over beer or something. Is like, but ultimately what matters is our systematic theology books, not our philosophy and our inquiry into these different topics. I don't know what he meant. I never followed up, but I had several very disappointing experiences trying to discuss political theology with different professors at either Boyce College or Southern Seminary, and finding out that they were welfare statists, but that they were, Fox News welfare statists, not MSNBC welfare statists. But that was part of what moved me to think we need to have a website at christianintellectual.com. We need to have some discussions about this, because within Southern Baptist life, I'm sure that this is a neglected topic. So there's that. It's hard to speculate on how things have changed over time since, as young as I am. How much have I even seen of these topics? I know that social media has caused a shift in how we relate to other people and in how we talk about intellectual topics. I think that it brings out, it sort of sets the stage for people to be who they want to be. I think of it as similar to hosting a party at your own house. Whenever you have a social media presence, you are inviting people to share in an experience of discussing things with you or looking at what you have to say. And because of that, you have to be attentive to shape the culture, to shape the expectations. That said, there's many people that just want to say, I dislike that, and that's all they want to do on social media. They probably wouldn't do that face to face. It's almost like in the old days when there were bulletin boards. It'd be one thing to go say something on a bulletin board and then walk away, and you don't have to be there when other people are reading it. That's what social media is. It's a bulletin board like that. But it encourages you to be there as often as you want. It's so convenient to show up to that bulletin board and to say what you want to say, and then and it gives you the chance to really think about. Maybe you're not that quick on your feet, but what we want to do is wait like 10 seconds and think about what's the perfect comeback to that, or you want to think about it for 10 minutes, and then you can just zing it in there, a perfect one-liner, and it feels like you're Cyrano de Bergerac because you've just got all of your
won.
wit.
You just
it feels
pure
like
wit. Yeah. So
but if there are people that go into it understanding that this is the temptation, and people that are willing to say things like, I don't know if I agree with you, or even I disagree with you, but I want to understand why you came to this conclusion. That's the kind of situation that, like, honestly, I would far prefer spend an hour discussing politics or theology over social media than to try to find somebody in a local church that wants to just have that conversation. Because there's going to be, just by the way the algorithm works, it's going to attract the people that actually know how to talk about this and that have an interest in it. It's very difficult to find that number of people that are that extremely interested in that topic in a group setting at like a church service.
you will not find, I hate to even quote him now because he's gone so far off the rails, but Lecrae said in one of his songs and one of his albums before he went, way off into La La Land, he says that church is more than, church work and football, and which is what you see today in even supposedly reformed congregations, is that instead of someone going, man, Pastor Bill just really pounded home this particular point, and it was just, convicting to me, and I really want to delve into this, and I don't even know if he was right, so let's talk about it. And like, no, they want to go, hey, so did you catch that preseason game last night? And so it's almost impossible in churches today to find somebody who's willing to have that intellectual conversation. And that's even in I am charismatic. Everybody wants to talk about eschatology. I'm charismatic, so I've got charismatic friends who are like, I just, the Spirit just spoke to me, and I just felt like I needed to stand up and speak in tongues. I'm like, I don't even want to talk about that. I want to talk about the doctrine and the theology that was in the sermon today. And nobody wants to do that. They want to talk about their feelings. They want to talk about their emotions, or they want to talk about everything but the substance in the form that was there. And so I can reach out to someone like you or follow you on Facebook. I can't interact right now because I'm in Facebook jail, but I can watch these things. I can read these things. I can go and search these things out. And so for me, social media has been great. And maybe to some degree, I exist in an echo chamber because of some of that as well, because maybe I'm not looking for counterpoint opinions from people very often. But I see social media where it's weak. It's not weak. It's not causing the weakness. It's weak because we're allowing it to be weak instead of going out and going to a Facebook group like one of yours, or to your website, and being challenged to step outside of our comfort zones. And that to me is just a reflection of where most churches are at today.
What you're describing, what people are missing, is this hunger to better themselves intellectually. And it's most of the time it's just because people are not aware that that's even an option, or they haven't thought much about what that would be like. So what we can do as communicators is, without being dismissive toward people that aren't owners of YouTube channels, we can at least invite people to say, the reason why we're doing this is because it's been a benefit to our own lives,
You
and
can
we
be
would encourage
complete.
you.
You can be completely dismissive to my YouTube channel.
But we would encourage you to investigate this issue and come up with what you think is the truth, and then practice articulating it. Maybe you don't want to be posting it on social media or making your own YouTube channel, but make sure that you know how to actually use words to explain what you think is true and what your convictions are, because they're a tool and they'll help you. You'll find out that you're not as clear as you thought. And I think it's a huge enriching experience to know what you think and why, and then to consider, okay, what's the implication? Do I need to talk about this or not? There are many things that I believe that I don't go talking about all the time. There are things that you just share with your friend, or that you would teach your kid at one or another stage in life. But being mentally active is a huge joy. And I think that the person that you're talking to that wants to just talk about football, it's not that they hate what you're doing. It's just they don't know what you're doing. And there has to be ways that we can help people come alive to that, to the value of that.
You said that in a far nicer way than I would have, because my experience has been most of them just hate what I'm doing. I'm a little jaded. So, for closing couple of minutes or closing thought here, what do you think is the most pressing concern for the intellectual Christian today, in light of everything that is happening? Regardless of where they might be denominationally or doctrinally, we could certainly have debates with people about those things, and I think those are great, healthy debates. But what do you think, for that person who is an intellectual, even if they don't see themselves that way, but as they do think deeply about topics and subjects, as it relates to the direction that our nation is headed, what should they be focusing on? What is really, truly, deeply pressing for them?
My impression is that the nation is headed in a certain way at breakneck speed, and that there's little that we can do to change it, but we can speak for the truth. And when you speak for the truth, then you are making sure that your own motivations are pure. You're making sure that your values are true to reality that God has made. So you make sure that you know what's right and wrong, so that when you get to the place where you're told, stick this jab in your arm, otherwise you're going to lose your job, you'll know what you think about that, and you'll be able to make the decision in good conscience, and that you'll be prepared. When we face persecution, it's coming. Be prepared. And I'm not saying that I know when it's coming or how or to what extent, but that's something that if you want to protect your own soul and your own family, you need to be prepared. You need to be ready, so that you don't get psychologically disabled when these things happen. It's much more dangerous that you become damaged in your soul than that you would, have the price of gas be inflated by 5 times, or the price of food. Like, we can be poor and we can be good people, but we're going to have thick skin, and we're going to have certainty, moral certainty, in order to confront these tyrants and cockroaches, and know how to respond to them in a way that is biblical, in a way that makes for peace, but sometimes may require bold action. We don't know what is coming, but we need to know what is right and wrong. That's where we're lacking right now. I mean, this is all just as a means of stewarding your own life and the life of your family. Be physically ready, be psychologically ready. And that means be in the Bible. Know what the Bible says. When people say things about what the Bible says, test it like a noble Berean. That's the answer. But it is going to require time. It is going to require thinking. And likely it's going to require getting to know other people that are trying to do that, because they can help you along that journey.
Yeah, I think one of the great weaknesses of most people within the church today is that when somebody challenges them on something, they respond much the same way as the leftist norm does, which is, oh, you're insulting me, oh, you hate me, oh, you think I'm a moron, uh, or you just think you're right about everything. And I'm like, no, I'm challenging. I want to have this conversation with you because it's very important to me. I think it's foundational for us to be able to work these things out. And everybody will just quickly throw out there, oh well, iron sharpens iron. But then when you really get down to the brass tacks of it, and you get to that place where iron is supposed to be sharpening iron, you and I would acknowledge that um, there are sparks when you're sharpening a blade like that, and and most people see those sparks and they back off and they're afraid of it because that conflict terrifies them. Because I think a lot of times they're not even aware that it's okay for there to be that conflict. And so it's easier for them to remain in their intellectual weakness and of their position. And so then when push comes to shove, and they're now out there having to make a defense for their position with somebody who does wish ill upon them, they're not ready. They're literally not ready. One of the things that I really appreciated about one of your guys' recent episodes was the fact that you said, well, I think it was Jacob was saying that the left aren't individualist, which is what Carl Truman's assertion is, that the left are individualists and we need to not be individualists. No, the left aren't. They are a hive mind, and they literally don't think for themselves. And I assert that, because I get tired of people referring to people on the left as libtards and stupid and crazy and whatnot. I think a lot of them are incredibly far more intellectual and far more logical in their ability to reason than a lot of people on the right or even conservative Christianity are. But they still have that hive mind of, this is what my group says and this is what my group thinks, and so therefore I will adhere to that and I will know those talking points inside and out. You can't get that from Christians today. They're for the most part, they just have no idea why they believe what they believe or how to give a defense for it at all. And I think that's incredibly dangerous.
I agree with your assessment. I mean, they have something that they're living for. The radical leftists really do care about making some kind of change in the world. They haven't maybe understood what they're doing to the world, but they do want to talk about what justice is and why. And I would like to see Christians doing that as well. I would like to see it. Well, I mean, wouldn't it be nice if the idea of being a social justice advocate or a justice advocate didn't necessarily attach to the left, but rather if people said, oh, they're Christians, so therefore they're clearly, I would expect them to be strong advocates of constitutional conservatism and the doctrine of the separation of powers and individual liberty. Like, that's a Christian thing. That obviously Christians care about that. And obviously many Christians are outspoken about that. Right now, you look at conservative Christians and you think, obviously conservative Christians are anti-abortion, or at least, yeah, I would hope that you would think that.
You would think, but
you would think. But wouldn't it be great if we actually, to take a line from the leftists, are we pro-life, all of life? Wouldn't it be great if we had a biblical definition of what being pro-human life means? And if we could connect that to individual rights, then we would be out there salt and light in the world. It doesn't mean that we are going to protect it from itself 100% of the time, but we would be a preserving force, and perhaps a preserving force in this nation, which would be a light to the world, a city on a hill, like it could be, has been in the past. That's my vision. It's just that we would be that preserving influence somehow.
Well, and I'll let you go here after I finish this thought. This is the reality is that, quite frankly, reactionary Christian conservatives are really no different than the leftist totalitarian authoritarians that they so foundationally despise. We just don't like their laws that they want to force on us at gunpoint. but we're way okay with enforcing our laws on them at gunpoint. And that translates to a variety of responses. You look at the crowd that is adamantly, I think all drugs should be illegal all the time, no matter what. You have no freedom to do those drugs, and we should throw you in prison for selling drugs and using drugs and having drugs. And abortion, and you just name those topics and you go down. All, especially with abortion, a topic that Christians should be able to agree on across the board. They want the power of the state involved on those topics. But when our opponents want the state involved on something, oh no, you're authoritarians. And our opponents look at us and go, well, no, you're authoritarians, because, and really somewhere in there, not in a mushy middle perspective, but somewhere in there is a logical and reasonable solution to those questions. That someone who has a biblical principle, and there again, by my perspective, that has a biblical principle and logic and reasoning should be able to step in and say, objectively, here's a solution that both sides should be able to agree on, that's better for all of society, without having to use the threat of force to solve that for you. And I think that's where a lot of the weakness comes in for the church, is that we've been arguing not philosophically against a position, but just the counter to a position most of the time.
So people are in the church saying, this is what's happening, and we're all not okay with it. And that's the extent of it.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, I'm not okay with this, and we don't know why. Hey, I'm going to put you in the green room real quick, and I'm going to do my close. You stick around so we can talk off camera. Everybody go check out their website. Give it to us one more time.
It's christianintellectual.com.
Yeah, they have a ton of information, and check out their YouTube, which is Christian Intellectual. Correct?
For the New Christian Intellectual.
For the New Christian Intellectual. Their YouTube channel is phenomenal. Definitely a lot more depth on some of these issues than you're going to get a lot of other places. And they are not afraid to, should we say, push around the sacred cows in Christianity today. So thank you so much for your time. And tell your co-host I'd like to get him on, or maybe have you guys both on and go do a deep dive on particular issues here sometime.
Excellent.
All right, stand by. All right, guys. I know for some of you these are dry conversations. I get it, because everybody wants these, fiery, especially right now as we're trying to here in the state of Minnesota and other places are trying to deal with people who are not expressing a strong conservative constitutional line. Some of my content with about the Minnesota Republican Party lately has been getting me a lot of traction, but these are the kind of conversations that matter going forward. And that's why I like to have these, especially on Monday nights. What Cody has to say and the stuff that his co-host Jacob have to say, I really wish you guys would go and check out their stuff. It's foundational, and it's fundamental, and it's pivotal for us to be able to rise above the normal mainstream Christian reactionary perspective and say, well, I'm conservative because I'm a Christian, and go out there and actually engage intellectually and logically, philosophically, with reasoning, with the people who we oppose on those issues. And while we love them in Christ, still be able to engage with them. Because I'm telling you right now, that's how we're going to make a difference. Shouting at people across the chasm isn't going to make a difference at all. Calling them libtards, yelling names at them isn't going to make a difference. Being insulting to people and coming up with all sorts of, and I do it sometimes, I call our governor Commissar Walls, but approaching them like they're stupid, approaching them like they're intellectually inferior to us is a danger. It's absolutely dangerous. And especially within your church, if you have people that disagree with you, you have to take the time to have a conversation with them and get to know them. I want to remind you guys one more time about Ardent Sales. I really enjoy these guys. So I'm going to just do a real quick share here and show you what they do one more time. The Ardent Sales Group is pretty cool, especially for my crowd who are very much into firearms. Here's what they have to offer. Even if you like to golf, if you're a firearms person, this kind of stuff is going to be fun for you. This one especially, I definitely think we should all be practicing this. We're not going to say why, but I definitely think this is important right now. So go check out the Ardent Sales Groups. They're good friends of the show, and they have been very supportive of me and my content over the last few weeks. And once again, reach out to Cody at his website. Find him on Facebook. Find his groups on Facebook. Be tuning in Wednesday night, especially if you're in Minnesota, but not just for Minnesota. This is a conversation I think that every single constitutional conservative is going to benefit from. I am having Ryan Wilson, who is the endorsed candidate for the Minnesota State Auditor, on Wednesday night at 7:30. Please be tuning in, because this is not going to be what you think it is. He has a constitutional perspective on what state auditor does, why they do it, and why it's important. And I think it is going to blow your minds at just how neglected that office has been, not just by the Republicans, but by the state as a whole. So tune in 7:30 Wednesday night for my conversation with him, and make sure you're sharing that out when you get it. Share this out, like, comment, and share. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. I depend on you guys, because my channel's growing, and the more it grows, the more I get ads. A little bit more money I make to absorb some of the cost of what it takes to do this on a regular basis. So my friends and my followers and my family who are watching, thank you so much for your time. And until next time, as always, Sic Semper Tyrannis.
We are going for liftoff in T-minus 30.
Stand by for further instructions, Minnesota Black Robe Regiment.
Secondary guidance systems engaged.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, it will be on my mark.
All systems are a go. All systems are a go.
Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, you are over the target. You are authorized to fire at